Akunohana is the Japanese translation of the flowers of evil. But is there even a single person who would think of flowers as evil? Well, there used to be someone, and he wrote this poem. And the sky was watching that superb cadaver blossom like a flower. So frightful was the stench that you believed you'd faint away upon the grass. The blowflies were buzzing round that putrid belly, from which came forth black battalions of maggots, which oozed out like a heavy liquid all along those living totters. All this was descending and rising like a wave, and this world gave forth singular music, like running water or the wind. And yet, you will be like this corruption, like this horrible infection, star of my eyes, sunlight of my being, you, my angel and my passion. Then, oh my beauty, say to the worms who will devour you with kisses that I have kept the form and the divine essence of my decomposed love. Charles Baudelaire was ahead of his time. No wonder the first edition of The Flowers of Evil was immediately censored, and A Carcass, which we just read, shows exactly why. Until 1857, poetry had mainly focused on describing the beautiful, so finding beauty in a carcass, that is, in evil, was unheard of. But why digress? See, in order to understand Shuzo Oshimi's Akunohana, we also have to understand Baudelaire's Flowers of Evil, which is why we will frequently expand on the French poet. So consider this your warning in case you don't like literature. For now, let's begin our discussion from the Japanese story and its main character, caught in an ambiguous tension toward both his muse, Psyche, and his femme fatale, Nakamura. Akunohana follows the story of Kasuga, a normal teenager who makes a dire mistake when, gone back to his classroom after school to retrieve his favorite book, he finds his crush Psyche's gym clothes and, giving in both to temptation and panic, he takes them home with him. Devoured by an immense sense of guilt, Kasuga's life takes a turn for the worse when one of his classmates, Nakamura, reveals that she saw everything. From that day, the two enter a contract according to which the boy has to obey every order by the girl to keep the secret. Only that Nakamura's intentions are to actually expose Kasuga's perversion, which she believes to be hiding under his skin. That's when she starts forcing him into immoral behaviors, which should only come natural to someone like him, she thinks, as if Kasuga's mistake could ultimately define his character. With the premise out of the way, we can divide the rest of the story into three major parts: the first and the second act, and the ending. The first act has Kasuga initially reject Nakamura, but after the moonlit night incident, he ends up embracing her. The second act follows Kasuga after moving out to a different town, while the ending finally wraps up all the narrative. Until said moonlit night incident, when the moon swells out, as Nakamura will say, Kasuga denies his perversion, but he never does so firmly. He either runs away, or he more desperately tries hiding it when he seals the stolen clothes in a box. Everything ends up playing into Nakamura's hands, who only gets confirmation of Kasuga being the same person as her. That is, someone who does not hide their perversion. And it all creates a vicious cycle where, not to confess his original sin, the boy obeys each and every one of the girl's orders, which only adds to the list of deviant acts he keeps getting blackmailed for, but never does Kasuga own up to them when offered the chance, which both society and Nakamura would love him to do, even if for opposite reasons. The former to punish him, while the latter to declare war against their fake town, leading a standardized and meaningless life. We've been using the term perversion, but what exactly do we mean by it? Surely we are referring to sexual perversion, which the manga abundantly suggests in its beginning. However, the Latin origin of the word, perversio, suggests an additional meaning, that of deviation. Figuratively, the deviation from the standard moral norms of society. So, when an individual strays away from it and does not conform to its code, he is considered deviant and, therefore, evil. Naturally, this can also manifest sexually, but we cannot tunnel vision on one single aspect, otherwise we would think too lightly of Kasuga and especially Nakamura's acts, when, instead, the twos is only one of the many ways to express their disagreement with society. And another question we might ask ourselves is, why is Kasuga even a pervert if he is one? Simply put, because he offends society, even if blackmailed, and he offends society at its core, when we consider that the one person he hurt is Psyche. Psyche is your ideal citizen with great scores and impeccable etiquette, not an but the example to follow. The reason why Kasuga perceives scandalous what he's forced to do by Nakamura is because he knows he's disobeying Psyche, society's incarnation. Everything is made even harder on him because, having read The Flowers of Evil, he's come to believe himself special. In a way, he should know how to deal with his sinful love for a girl, and yet, his only solution is running away. He runs away when Nakamura tells him she saw what he did. He then hides the stolen clothes. Eventually, he changes town as well. Kasuga, as the cringe and edgy teenager he is, still in the legitimate process of understanding his personality and the world around him, couldn't possibly hope to grasp a monumental piece like Baudelaire's, but at least he is aware of his tension between both good and evil. Should he confess his sin to atone for it, or to declare war to society? The truth is that there is no better personification of the Flowers of Evil than Nakamura. She's that darkness and perversion society fights, the exact opposite of Psyche, who's idealized as the moon by Kasuga. Tonight the moon dreams with more indolence, like a lovely woman on a bed of cushions who fondles with a light and listless hand the contour of her breasts before falling asleep. On the sudden back of the billowing clouds, languishing, she lets herself fall into long swoons and casts her eyes over the white phantoms that rise in the azure like blossoming flowers. When, in her lazy listlessness, she sometimes sheds a furtive tear upon this globe, a pious poet, enemy of sleep, in the hollow of his hand catches this pale tear with iridescent reflections of opal and hides it in his heart afar from the sun's eyes. In Sadness of the Moon, the celestial body is represented by Baudelaire in an oniric and sensual state of languish that culminates in the poet collecting its tear away from the sun's gaze. Because of its vulnerability, the moon becomes a symbol of human sorrow, with the poet desiring to enter in contact with it by catching its tear. This piece reflects Romanticism's fascination with nature, whose splendor is further emphasized by the comparison to a woman, expression of ideal and ethereal beauty. It's ironic, isn't it? How the tables will turn when Psyche eventually shows her true colors, after paradoxically dating Kasuga, giving him proof that even the ones at the top of society, hypocritically, are no strangers to perversion. This ambiguity between good and evil is an essential part in Baudelaire's poetics, whose original portrayal of women may allow us to better understand the duality tearing Kasuga apart. The poet's love for women is expressed as a zest for life, fascination with beauty, and as an impossible dream of an elsewhere, the so-called other side, where existence flows serenely and hopefully. Baudelaire sang of love exalting both its pure spirituality and its sensual carnality. But he did not forget to also focus on its cruelty and perversion, as beautiful as also terrible and deceiving. The woman for Baudelaire is no longer bound to a religious ideal like the female perfection of the Madonna or woman angel of the Stilnovists. Rather, she's now become an ambiguous and often evil icon, a femme fatale, very aware of her sexuality, who bends man into a submissive and dependent position. Victim of his own senses, man plunges into the temptation of a no longer heavenly love, but demonic, like in the poem The Vampire, where the woman is compared to such a monster. The opposite figure to the woman angel is expressed in the Dante-inspired poem titled The Beatrice. Unlike the still novist's woman, Baudelaire does not bestow bliss. Instead, this lyric is a depiction of a surreal episode in which little devils encircle the poet to taunt him by belittling his poetry. Though he could remain indifferent, Baudelaire is greatly mortified when he realizes that, in this crowd insulting him, is also his woman. Contradicting all that's been said until now, the woman as an angelic figure in the idea of a platonic love is sung in the poem to a passerby. In the urban setting of a chaotic Paris, Baudelaire sees a beautiful woman and he remains astonished by her simply revitalizing walking by, but as soon as she leaves his sight, the poet falls back into the spleen. Baudelaire is complicated, to be fair, as he never gave up the right to contradict himself in his poems, and so, still reminiscent of classic views, the woman is for the author a way to reach the ideal. In fact, his senses are awoken by her sensuality, even if this access to the ideal only ever happens outside of reality, in either memories or dreams. But Baudelaire also sees in this character his ruin, which aggravates his spleen. As a both good and evil figure, the woman with her beauty is of unsure origin for the poet, who even wonders whether she comes from hell or paradise in hymn to beauty. Do you come from heaven or rise from the abyss? Beauty. Your gaze, divine and infernal, pours out confusedly benevolence and crime, and one may for that compare you to wine. You contain in your eyes the sunset and the dawn. You scatter perfumes like a stormy night. Your kisses are a philter, your mouth an amphora, which make the hero weak and the child courageous. Do you come from the stars or rise from the black pit? Destiny, bewitched, follows your skirts like a dog. You sow at random joy and disaster, and you govern all things but answer for nothing. You walk upon corpses which you mock, O beauty. Of your jewels, horror is not the least charming, and murder, among your dearest trinkets, dances amorously upon your proud belly. Whether you come from heaven or from hell, who cares, O beauty? Huge, fearful, ingenious monster. From God or Satan, who cares? Angel or siren, who cares? If you make fay with the velvet ties, rhythm, perfume, glimmer, my one and only queen, the world less hideous, the minutes less leaden. This right here is the reason why Saiki and Nakamura are two sides of the same coin, which prevents Kasuga from listening to one without lending his ear to the other. Because Akunohana is about a conflict of views in its first act, regarding a teenager in his forming years, who's not sure which one of the two diametrically opposite options to follow, and the two choices are personified into two characters who ultimately belong to the same Baudelairean figure that brings one both to the ideal and spleen. In short, should Kasuga follow Nakamura and suffer because of how different they are from their town and so attempt at reaching the other side? Or should he join this side with Saiki, who's the ideal produced by society and conform to it? Naturally, the ideal Nakamura tends to is very different from Saiki. But what are these spleen and ideal we've been talking about? I fear we might have to insist on Baudelaire's poetics before resuming this story, so bear with me. Spleen and Ideal is the first of the 6 sections into which the Flowers of Evil is divided, with the following 5 being Parisian scenes, the wine, the Flowers of Evil, rebellion, death. The poem's distribution forms an existential journey. Firstly, the poet becomes aware of how different and alienated he is from the world, which leads him to experience an uneasiness called spleen. He tries to curb it by observing and immersing himself in Paris, but here he only sees the people suffer. He then takes refuge in artificial paradises, such as alcohol and drugs, or sinful and destructive loves, but he never reaches the irrational and beyond ideal because of how ephemeral these pleasures are. The poet eventually rebels against God through the invocation of Satan, finally rejecting the world through death, not as a passage to a new life, but as destruction and undoing in a desperate attempt to find in the unknown something new, as seen in the voyage, which closes the Flowers of Evil. Pour out your poison, that it may refresh us. This fire burns our brains so fiercely, we wish to plunge to the abyss's depths. Heaven or hell, does it matter? To the depths of the unknown, to find something new. The spleen, more specifically, is an organ associated with the bile, which the Greeks thought the reason for melancholy. As a deep and desperate existential anguish that propels the poet into a state of chronic malaise, the spleen is only the malady of the modern world. In contrast, the ideal is the inspiration to an elusive beyond, a supernatural reality of pristine beauty, contrasting the world of finitude and imperfection. Love for women, as anticipated, is one way to reach the ideal, if only temporarily before falling back down into the spleen again. This is because the ideal can only be achieved through beauty and art. Kasuga is roughly aware of all this information, since he's read The Flowers of Evil, but that does not mean he understands it. Actually, he does not get it at all, while insisting he's special when, instead, it's Nakamura to feel the same as Baudelaire. In truth, there isn't a more critical moment in life than during one's adolescence for the internalization of values, and Nakamura lives with only her dad in a modest house. Her diary, full of scribbles, reflects the state of her mind. The girl desires deeply to leave for a distant land, to travel to another side, beyond the mountain facing her town. No wonder chapter 2 is titled Invitation to Voyage, a poem where Baudelaire narrates of a foreign land, comparing it to a beautiful woman. There, all is order and beauty, luxury, peace, and pleasure. Nakamura is the Albatross Baudelaire describes in the homonymous piece. Like the great seabird, prince of cloud and sky, the poet rises to the highest levels of perception, but once on land, he cannot move. The poet is portrayed as a spirit who rose above other men, who's able to perceive with his sensitivity the secret correspondences between objects in nature, which are basically bridges to the ideal. And among those objects are also evil ones, and precisely because of this ability of seeing beauty in the grotesque, Baudelaire was cursed and ridiculed by society. The poet has come to interpret reality in the light of his dream, rebellious against convention, unfit for practical life, destined to cast discredit on the common passions, to unsettle hearts, to bear witness through art to the ideal, of which man finds confusing images through all too brief ecstasies. In another poetry which is not part of the Flowers of Evil, The Stranger, one of the characters is questioned by another about what he loves. Unlike the asking bourgeois, the answering stranger does not have family nor friends. He doesn't love his nation or even gold. What he loves are the wonderful and high-up passing clouds. There is a clear difference between the finite world and the endless sky, with its free clouds distant from the corruption of society. A corruption exemplified by the arid, geometrical setup of modern cities, promoting the same anonymity and alienation that affected Paris's unsung anti-heroes, like the beggar, the blind, the industrial worker, the gambler, the prostitute, the old. The city, just like Nakamura's town, has been transformed into an anthill of identical bourgeois. It should now be clear that, since neither Baudelaire nor Nakamura are from this world, the stress should not be put on their eccentricity, but on their separation, on the desire of an elsewhere. To be fair, this is something we are all in together, as Baudelaire's introduction to the Flowers of Evil affirms, when he directly talks to us. But among the jackals, the panthers, the beach hounds, the apes, the scorpions, the vultures, the serpents, the yelping, howling, growling, crawling monsters, in the filthy menagerie of our vices, there is one more ugly, more wicked, more filthy. Although he makes neither great gestures nor great cries, he would willingly make of the earth a shambles and, in a yawn, swallow the world. He is ennui, his eye watery as though with tears. He dreams of scaffolds as he smokes his hookah pipe. You know him, reader, that refined monster. Hypocritish reader, my fellow, my brother. If there are two things that Nakamura and Kasuga share, one is isolation, as they are both alienated from the context of their too normal town, even if it's just Nakamura to be actually special. The second element they have in common is a deep desire to run away. But, again, only one really means to run away from the world, while the other only vaguely and unsurely fantasizes about it because he's read Baudelaire. And it will be this indecisiveness, typical of a teenager who's still forming their moral values, that corners Kasuga into joining Nakamura in the moonlit night incident when sneaked into school at night and felt deeply insulted by being called normal. Kasuga vandalizes the place, confessing his sin and rebelling to the world under the offended moon's watch. O moon, whom our ancestors discreetly adored, radiant Seraglio, from the blue country's height to which the stars follow you in dashing attire, my ancient Cynthia, lamp of our haunts, do you see the lovers on their prosperous palates, showing as they sleep the cool enamel of their mouths, the poet beating his forehead over his work, or the vipers coupling under the withered grass? Under your yellow domino, with quiet step, do you go as in days of old from morn till night, to kiss the faded charms of Endymion? I see your mother, child of this impoverished age, bending toward her mirror a heavy weight of years, skillfully disguising the breast that nourished you. The offended moon expresses Baudelaire's disillusionment with life. Once revered, the moon now holds no significance. No longer source of romantic idealism, the moon has become a mere device for a cynical view of the world. In addition to portraying nature's brutality in the last stanza, the poem critiques society when it speaks of impoverished age, emphasizing the negativity with the contrasting picture of sleeping lovers. This is how Kasuga is beginning to feel. If you thought we were done with education, I have bad news for you, because we have to talk about the criminological theory of the black sheep. Noel Mayhew argues that the young delinquent is characterized by a negative perception of himself, derived from the internalization of negative expectations projected onto him by his parents or other significant adults. In other words, the environment sends negative messages to the young person who, after gradually absorbing them, is led to performing deviant actions. Paradoxically, the following punishment will only confirm this negative image of the self, which will bring the kid closer to criminal subcultures in order to feel accepted by somebody. The feeling that arises in the teenager is therefore one of social discomfort, which reminds us of Kasuga's case, and even though Nakamura cannot be considered a significant figure to him in the beginning, she still forces a negative identification onto the boy through the reiteration of deviant acts, all the while constantly calling out his perversion. If we then consider how many times Kasuga calls on to Baudelaire for advice and help, surely not an ideal figure for society. Quite the opposite, in fact. It's safe to assume that Kasuga is a boy who can't help but absorb negative messages from his environment, which ends up shaping his behavior and thought. Erickson's theory on the choice of the negative identity is also an interesting one. According to the author, the adolescent chooses an identity pervertedly based on all those identifications and roles that, in critical stages of development, were presented to him as undesirable or dangerous, and yet very real. Certain circumstances bring the adolescent to choose the negative identity simply because it is easier for him to identify with what he should absolutely not be, rather than to fight and conquer a sentiment of reality in accepted roles that are unfortunately unreachable with his interior means. Again, this is not Kasuga's exact case, but it still highlights how a morally indecisive adolescent could potentially choose the wrong path when lacking a strong moral code. Incidentally, it is no coincidence that Nakamura is never home, and later in the story, Kasuga as well. This is because one's home is the natural haven where standard values are taught. So, between being normal or deviant, Kasuga chooses to rest in the flower of evil together with Nakamura. "Look, Baudelaire," he screamed when he splashed paint while embracing perversion. But if a few moments after Nakamura says she looks forward to the next morning, when everyone will finally learn the truth, Kasuga does not appear so confident. In a lucky turn of events, nobody manages to decipher the message. Except for Saiki, who would strangely forgive Kasuga if only he didn't run away again. Eventually, the secret gets out and the only place left to escape to is beyond the mountain. But will things really be different over there? Different than the nobodies, nowheres, and nothings of their hometown, where every light goes on living as usual for eternity? Nakamura wonders. When Saiki intercepts the fugitives, Kasuga wavers once again. Who should he follow? Nakamura, the pervert, or Saiki, the societal ideal? Admittedly, he has no idea what to do. He surely enjoys picturing himself special, even if he does not understand Baudelaire. But he also confesses he preferred loving Saiki ideally. He loved the pure idea of the girl, not her real her. In conclusion, at this point in time, Kasuga is not entirely normal, but he's not a pervert either. He's just an empty adolescent whose indecision costs him everything when he's taken back home by the police along with the other kids. In a way, it is as if society, enforcing its norms, said, "You cannot escape me." Kasuga is what could be called a marginal man, and according to Robert Park, the marginal man is one whom fate has condemned to live in two societies and in two, not merely different, but antagonistic cultures. His mind is the crucible in which two different and refractory cultures may be said to melt and, either wholly or in part, fuse. Though the main figure of the Chicago school meant the marginal man as someone divided between two ethnic cultures, the theory can still be connected to our topic. The marginal man, like Kasuga, is someone suspended between two worlds. He ambiguously participates in both, even intimately, but he never leaves one or the other, which also prevents him from being accepted by either of them. Back to this story. The failed escape over the mountain knocks Kasuga down for a while. Not only does he stop reading those weird books that allegedly made him special, but he also realizes that he betrayed both this and the other side when he stood on the limit of the two worlds. Inspired by an evil dream with Nakamura left completely alone in it, Kasuga renews his allegiance to perversion and decides that if he can't go to the other side, then the other side will come to him. This is when he sets up a tent, a very perverted place, where he plans his future immoral acts, all the while conquering Nakamura's trust back, toward whom he shows submissive behavior. In the meantime, Saiki hardly believes that someone is not gravitating to her person for the first time in her life. Possibly to cope with her feelings, she justifies her love for the weird Kasuga, mentioning his odd books or his indifference to the people's opinion, elements which directly contradict her very existence. Saiki has in fact spent her entire life in a bubble, doing, liking, saying and thinking what others told her to. Truthfully, Her best friend Ai put it best. She's just in love with love. She's only jealous someone took her ex-boyfriend, and someone who's her opposite at that. Nothing wrong here, until she finds the other side built by Kasuga, where instead of condemning the obscenity of the place, all she seems to care about is that Nakamura was there too. That's when she forces herself onto the boy, before purging the place by setting it on fire. In the end, Nakamura was right, just like everyone in town. Psyche is corrupted to the core, and by the way, who's the real pervert here? Nakamura, who strips Kasuga naked 3 times in this story to metaphorically peel off the flesh hiding his real self, or Psyche, who only needs one chance? I view this event in an interesting way. It is as if society, incarnated in its ideal Psyche and having failed to take Kasuga back to its standards peacefully, now uses its overwhelming force to penetrate its values into the deviant. I'm also inclined to believe a little that Psyche likes Kasuga for being different and wanting to know her real her, meaning she too has signs of transgression. However, these are quickly calmed as the internalization of societal values is too strong in her to allow a rebellion, and this will show in the second act of the story, with her moving on living an extremely normal life. But we will have confirmation of this even earlier than that, and I mean when she turns herself in to take the blame on behalf of Kasuga for everything, the fire included, as a role model should. Before going to the police station to turn herself in, Psyche leaves us with an interesting speech that interprets Kasuga's view as valid, but also wrong, because followed by the vast minority of society. A speech that, for your pleasure, will later let us explore the criminological theme of stigmatization. On the same occasion, and this is even more important, she calls out Kasuga's perversion as make-believe, which we can't really deny, seeing how it's only Nakamura to be the real Albatross. And she also wants to have sex here, yet another confirmation that society hides its perversion, while hypocritically condemning it on the outside. So, with the other side both physically and conceptually destroyed, following the Flowers of Evil script, the only remaining solution for Nakamura and Kasuga is death, especially now that the secret is leaked to all of town. Greeted the sunset, a prettily disgusting one, Nakamura says. The two proceed to condemn society one final time with a speech before attempting suicide, echoing Baudelaire's philosophy. The part with "here is hell, this town is hell" is interesting because, differently from Dante where hell is in another dimension, Baudelaire and Nakamura believe the earth to be hell, but in a twist of events, Nakamura pushes Kasuga away, and even if he cannot understand why, we have come to know the reason, and even Psyche knows that Kasuga, deep down, is normal. And so the first act ends with the metaphorical closure of the Flower of Evil. I beg pity of thee, the only one I love, from the depths of the dark pit where my heart has fallen. It's a gloomy world with a leaden horizon, where through the night swim horror and blasphemy. A frigid sun floats overhead 6 months, and the other 6 months darkness covers the land. It's a land more bleak than the polar wastes, neither beasts nor streams nor verdure nor woods. But no horror in the world can surpass the cold cruelty of that glacial sun, and this vast night, which is like cold chaos. I envy the lot of the lowest animals, who are able to sink into a stupid sleep. So slowly does this skein of time unwind. Let's be real here. One could say that, finally, the second act is where the story quits being about some crazy bitch blackmailing a dude who falls in love with her, and begins taking the shape of a coming-of-age manga, where characters discover values despite the dark side of youth and the murky self-consciousness. In words other than the mangaka's, Akunohana's theme in its second act is no longer about morally conforming or deviating from society, because we've had multiple confirmations that Kasuga is indeed normal despite his confusion. Instead, the theme is about growing up, maturing, and appreciating humanity and sensitivity. In other terms, this part of the story is about turning evil into good, and I believe that the art's improvement reflects the growth asked to some of the characters. So, resuming the story, we see Kasuga and his family forced to exile to a different town, ironically located on the other side of the mountain. Unfortunately, the place isn't unlike his hometown, which only complicates things considering the boy struggles to move on from his dark past. Traces of the flower of evil still linger on his body, but this is also where Tokiwa comes in, a girl who strangely parallels Nakamura in many aspects, one of them being Baudelaire. This time though, the poet is only a device through which the two get to know each other and, more importantly, it's thanks to her that Kasuga picks reading back up. Not with the intention of creating space between him and others, but to immerse himself in what he likes. Though, to be fair, it's also to distract his mind. Observation which makes him wonder whether 1. He's still running away from his problems, and 2. If Tokiwa is only a stand-in for Nakamura. Not long after making her acquaintance, Kasuga is confronted by Tokiwa's boyfriend who's learned of the two's ever closer friendship, which is also where we begin to understand more about this character, as someone who's never tried to break the wall in their couple. What I'm trying to say is that Kasuga discovers he's not the only ghost in town, someone who suffers in silence with nobody coming to their rescue, since Tokiwa is also another one, and Nakamura must have been like that too. In more detail, the second act is where elements from the previous part come back around under a different light. For instance, books used to let Kasuga detach himself from others, well, now they serve as a connection to them. Another example is the theme of emptiness. Kasuga used to define himself empty, morally empty, to be precise, since he could never pick a side. But now his character is all about being mature, that is, emotionally intelligent, allow me to say. No longer does Kasuga need to pick a side, because, in all honesty, he's always belonged to the normal world. Now, his arc revolves around growing up within that side and making choices close to what adults make. Lastly, there is the theme of escapism. It is no lie that Kasuga has kept running away from his problems, but this is where things start to change. Even if scared, discouraged, and humiliated by Tokiwa's empty boyfriend, Kasuga plucks up his courage and declares his love for the girl right in front of him, taking her away. But it would be more correct to say that he rescues her. Like angels with well-beast eyes, I shall return to your bedroom and silently glide toward you with the shadows of the night. And, dark beauty, I shall give you kisses cold as the moon and the caresses of a snake that crawls around a grave. When the livid morning comes, you'll find my place empty, and it will be cold there till night. I wish to hold sway over your life and youth by fear, as others do, by tenderness. In The Ghost, Baudelaire tells the story of a spectre come to haunt an old love with unresolved and lingering emotions. A similar story to what Kasuga is going through. Is there a solution though? Could one exorcise a ghost, and if so, how? Well, as the novel Tokiwa is writing suggests, you just have to kill them. Not in the literal sense of the word. You need to confront them, and for Kasuga, the final boss to defeat is right up ahead. The catalyst that leads to the ending is none other than Psyche, who we casually come across in the new town. Though, as mentioned already, the girl has gone on living mindlessly, which we understand when Kasuga catches up with her at a cafe. Her dialogue gives a sad portrayal of her impossibility to recount any event that happened after the fire incident. And, on top of that, her boyfriend is a Kasuga lookalike. Basically, she has not grown up from the darkness experienced years back. Still, if there is one thing she's correct about, it's that Kasuga is still on the run, and to make sure Tokiwa is not just a replacement for Nakamura, he must get closure with the latter. In short, Kasuga has to kill the ghost of his past. Not before quitting to be a ghost himself, which is when, in my favorite chapter, after making Tokiwa his and embracing the warmth of her body, a feeling ghosts cannot perceive. He gets back home and announces his physical presence with his scream, "I'm home." That is also when his family magically picks itself back together from all the struggles endured because of their son. Before confronting Nakamura, Kasuga attends his grandpa's funeral, someone that, despite having lived all his normal life in a normal town, still led a worthy existence and received his dear one's love until the end. This is also where I'd like to go on a brief tangent and mention the criminological theme of stigmatization, which is what Kasuga's wider family suffered from. Stigmatization is a topic that ties back to that one conversation where Saiki had considered Kasuga's view wrong, simply because followed by the minority of society. In particular, the labeling theory saw its origins in the US during the 60s when, treated unjustly by the whites in public places, black people fought for equal rights. At the time, criminologists began investigating society more deeply, with a special focus on understanding what the effects of belonging to an ethnic class different from the dominant one were. For our analysis, it's interesting to note that, according to one of the school's exponents, Becker, it is society to create deviancy in order to perpetuate itself and its ethical code. An action is not deviant per se, rather, it is deviant because it is labeled as such. What this means is that one act can be simultaneously viewed in two antithetical ways, but in the end, it is a specific group's perspective to prevail, the majority's. More in detail, a person becomes deviant when he commits an act society adverses. Once the crime is discovered, or even invented, and unfairly attributed to someone, the stigma is successfully applied. Sex, race, and social standing are key factors for the labeling process, which eventually culminates to a public sentence. Not before the end of all socio-economic chances in society for the actor and his friends or family, just like in the case of Kasuga's wider family. Finally, even if the deviant were to abandon his minor culture, he would still not be able to integrate into the main one, because the stigma cannot be simply washed away. Anyway, moving back on to the ending, as if traversing a different dimension, suspended drops of water accompany Kasuga and Tokiwa on their journey to Nakamura. When they arrive, they find the girl in front of the sea, but besides looking disturbingly calm, she too, like Saiki, reveals to have forgotten all the events that followed after her attempted suicide. When she praises the sunset, Kasuga wonders if it's any different than the one they had greeted years before. And actually, in Baudelaire, the hypnotic image of the sun shining on the ocean symbolizes freedom, opulence, but also sadness and the finiteness of earthly life. Tell me, does your heart sometimes fly away, Agatha, far from the black ocean of the filthy city, toward another ocean where splendor glitters, blue, clear, profound as is virginity? Tell me, does your heart sometimes fly away, Agatha? The sea itself can lead both to enchantment as well as despair. And we go, following the rhythm of the wave, lulling our infinite on the finite of the seas. Nakamura must have been absorbed in such thoughts, and to answer Kasuga's question whether their hometown sunset was different, yes, it was. One shone before town, the other before the sea, and we have seen how these two places have a vastly different meaning. Tired of her inertly stuck on gazing at the sun, out of the character he used to be, Kasuga starts beating the ghost out of Nakamura, revitalizing her with the wave's agreement. At the end of their friendly fight, Nakamura tells Kasuga not to come back anymore, as he is only normal, and the sun finally sets. It seemed delightful to me, and all the more delightful the harder the task was to extract beauty from evil. The disgust for the real world and the fascination for an ideal one brought Baudelaire to narrate his failed attempt at reaching the other side in The Flowers of Evil. Rather than reflecting on the fallen moral values of modern society or realizing art's lost essence, Baudelaire's critics at the time preferred focusing on the oddity of his poetry, overlooking good and evil's deeply intertwined relationship. An already mentioned poem, Hymn to Beauty, expresses this inseparable bond between hell and heaven when it considers the infernal and the divine not alternative but co-present. The triumph of evil in Baudelaire is therefore an attempt to gain entry into ideality. In his poetics, man is always training upward to infinity, yet he is a creature who must satisfy his satanic pull to understand the heavenly one. In this irreducible tension, it is beauty to allow man to access the ideal. The beauty present in evil too, and this is exactly Baudelaire's revolution. The title itself, The Flowers of Evil, reflects the coexistence of these paradoxes. Still, only a glimpse of the fleeting and unreachable ideal can be offered by art, love, or dreams, which is why Baudelaire finally found in death the solution. But we don't have to go that far. If there is a lesson that Akunohana tries to teach us, it's definitely the one about exorcising evil and turning it into good. In other words, the lesson is to get over one's darkness and turn it around into something positive. Art, whichever may your art be, and love can help to achieve that. Sometimes even dreams, like the one Kasuga has in the future. Once again reading Baudelaire's work for the university he's attending with Tokiwa, Kasuga is shown writing a story, Under the Moon's Watch. Shortly after, in his sleep, he finds himself in a familiar dream where, in the middle of normal ones, a gigantic flower of evil appears to be losing its petals. Narratively, the petals reach and connect all the people of his life, who all seem to have luckily found a happy ending. Even Nakamura, who's, despite still fascinated by the sun, slowly integrating into society, possibly thanks to her mother, a character that had been said to be similar to her. Now, despite this being only a dream, and a very cathartic one at that, there is no reason not to believe it in anticipation of the future. In fact, dreams in Baudelaire are not only a vehicle for the ideal, but they can also grant the dreamer a clairvoyant vision. The ending then continues with the reveal of how Nakamura had been perceiving the world from the very first chapter. The spleen is visually represented affecting the world and making it an ugly and corrupted place, trying to infect and creep into her. But suddenly Kasuga appears out of the shadow formerly engulfing him. That's the episode in which he'd stolen Psyche's clothes. When she recounts the events in her diary, there is, needless to say, a sun drawn. Later that day, as she is about to succumb to the spleen, Kasuga saves her and her surroundings magically turn normal. It seems the world has a reason to exist if she's not suffering alone in it, if there is even the slightest hope of exorcising the ghost we can all fall victim to. I would, to compose my eclogues justly, lie down close to the sky like an astrologer, and, near the church towers, listen while I dream to their solemn anthems borne to me by the wind. My chin cupped in both hands, high up in my garret, I shall see the workshops where they chatter and sing, the chimneys, the belfries, those masts of the city, and the skies that make one dream of eternity. It is sweet, through the mist, to see the stars appear in the heavens, the lamps in the windows, the streams of smoke rise in the firmament, and the moon spread out her pale enchantment. I shall see the springtimes, the summers, the autumns, and when winter comes with its monotonous snow, I shall close all the shutters and draw all the drapes so I can build at night my fairy palaces. Then I shall dream of pale blue horizons, gardens, fountains weeping into alabaster basins, of kisses, of birds singing morning and evening, and of all that is most childlike in the idol. Riot, storming vainly at my window, will not make me raise my head from my desk, for I shall be plunged in the voluptuousness of evoking the springtime with my will alone, of drawing forth the sun from my heart and making of my burning thoughts a warm atmosphere. It seems the world has a reason to exist if she's not suffering alone in it. If there... Damn, dude, I got emotional there. if there is even the slightest hope of exorcising the ghost we can all fall victim to.